what really strikes me about all of your suggestions compared to the other groups this morning, I've had two other groups, and they were much more negative in many ways. You know, they saw futures of destruction and flooding and climate chaos and resources running out. And actually, by and large, you've got a more positive disposition, though there's a bit of sort of balance in there, or raises at least a lot of the questions. But clearly, I mean, what you've just been, and thank you for all of those suggestions. I mean, what you've all suggested there are, you know, ways of helping us start imagining the future. This is the first steps in trying to get beyond the here and now. And what I want to do now is give you a little sort of mini talk of 7 or 8 minutes, talking a bit about the problem of short-term thinking and why we need to extend our time horizons to the future. Because I think, you know, in most of our societies, very much locked in the present moment. So I'm just going to share my screen and talk and give you some examples, in fact, of what I think of as time rebels, which are organizations and individuals who are committed to long-term thinking and intergenerational justice. So let me just share my screen with you now. So yeah, I want to say something about extending our time horizons. And it's clear, I think, that we live in a very short-term world where our politicians, as you can see there, Boris Johnson can barely see beyond the next election or even the latest tweet. Businesses can't see beyond the quarterly report. The markets are spiking and crashing in speculative bubbles. And then at international conferences, nations sit around arguing away while the planet burns and species disappear. And of course, you know, we're also locked on our phones, looking at them 110 times a day, clicking the buy now button. This definitely is the age of the tyranny of the now. We're caught in short-term cycles. And it's also clear that we've so many long-term challenges coming our way. We've got the climate crisis, which of course is already here in so many ways. Global heating, sea level rises. We've got threats from new technologies like artificial intelligence, drone warfare, bioweapons. We've got legacies of the past, like, you know, racial injustice, which gets passed on from generation to generation, embedded in criminal justice institutions and culture more generally. We need more long-term thinking to deal with that. We need more long-term thinking to deal with the next pandemic that might be on the horizon, especially if they haven't been classified, as Faith was pointing out. And the way I think about this is that humankind, particularly in wealthy countries, that we've colonized the future. We treat the future like a distant colonial outpost where we can freely dump ecological degradation and technological risk as if there was nobody there. And it's future generations who pay the price, particularly in the global south, in developing countries, or people on the socioeconomic margins in wealthy countries. And, you know, if those future generations are given no political rights or representation, they have no influence in our economies. And I think this cartoon sums up the problem quite well, that there's a hell of a lot of crap that we've inherited from the past, colonial racism, for example. And then there's the crap that we generate ourselves, you know, toxic waste, environmental problems, debt, climate change. But our attitude is very much that we'll let our kids and our grandkids, will let you in your future sort it out. And that there's a great injustice here. This is what intergenerational injustice looks like, these legacies that we're passing on to future generations. But it's quite hard to picture those generations in the future. They can be quite abstract. So you can think about it this way. Here's a little diagram from my book, The Good Ancestor. There are 7.7 billion people alive today, the little green circle. But in the gray circle, over the last 50,000 years, an estimated 100 billion people have been born and died. But they are far outweighed by the nearly 7 trillion people will be born over the next 50,000 years, assuming current birth rates level off and stabilize. And in the next 2 centuries alone, tens of billions of people will be born, amongst them your children and their grandchildren, going on and on and on. And it really raises a question for us about what legacy are we going to leave for those generations of the future? What legacy are you going to leave for the Cheney students of the year 2050 and after that? And in order to get a little bit of inspiration for helping us extend our minds into the future, I'm going to just show you some images from 7 different projects, which are all about trying to help us imagine the future and connect with those future generations. And at the end, I'm going to ask you to choose the one that you find the most inspiring and to tell me why. And I'm going to ask you to write that in the chat, but I'll show you that in a moment. So keep an eye on these 7 and keep in your mind one that you might want to hone in on as one that you think is particularly interesting. So here's an example of long-term thinking. This is the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, which is collecting millions of seeds in an indestructible rock bunker in the Arctic Circle that's designed to last 1,000 years. So it's an incredibly long-term project about preserving the world's plant biodiversity into the future. The next image is a project from a design company called Superflux, based in London, or actually an Anglo-Indian design company, where they were asked to design the world in 2030 for the government of the United Arab Emirates. And one of the things they designed, as you can see in the picture there, a little kind of pollution machine where you pull the trigger and it fires the air that you would have to breathe in the year 2030, assuming business as usual and we keep using fossil fuels. So it's this incredibly noxious, poisonous air that you'll have to breathe. And you can see some of the smoke there. This next project is an art exhibition in Finland, in Helsinki, called Klima X, where the whole exhibit is underwater. You have to go in those yellow wellies that you can see there. They're melting blocks of ice. And of course, it's all about alerting us to sea level rise, but it's an experiential exhibit. This next one is a 100-year art project created by the Scottish artist Katie Patterson, who you can see there, where every year for 100 years, a famous writer is donating a book which will remain completely secret and unread in the future library until the year 2114, at which point the 100 books will be printed on paper made from 1,000 trees which have been planted in a forest outside Oslo. Now, the first person to donate a book was Margaret Atwood. You can see in the top left there, Han Kang, the Korean novelist, in the bottom left. Next to her, Elif Shafak, Turkish writer. And just think, Margaret Atwood is never going to see the book she's donated published in her own lifetime. It will be printed in 2114 when she's long dead. And this is a project about thinking about our legacies to the future. What gifts are we going to pass on to the generations to come? Now, this project looks 100 years ahead. The next one, called the Clock of the Long Now, or the 10,000-year clock, looks 10 millennia ahead. This is a real clock being built as we speak inside a limestone mountain in Texas. And it's a clock that is designed to stay accurate for 10,000 years. And you'll be able to visit this clock and go inside it, go up steps of the mountain, each of them equivalent of a million years of geological time. And it's like a secular altarpiece to a long-term thinking civilization to help us take responsibility for future generations, to bring them into our minds. But alongside that art project, there are really important political long-term projects going on, these time rebels who care about intergenerational justice and long-term thinking. One of them is a movement in the US called Our Children's Trust, which is a legal organization, a public interest law firm that has filed a landmark case against the US government on behalf of the 21 young people who you can see there, who are campaigning for the legal right to a safe climate and a healthy atmosphere for both current and future generations. So these young people have sued the US government, to stop them, try and stop the government giving subsidies to fossil fuel companies. And legal movements like this are exploding around the world, all about giving rights to future generations. If you think about, this is one of the most extraordinary shift in rights since the French Revolution in the 18th century. And one final example is something called future design, and which is a Japanese movement for long-term decision-making in local politics, where local people are invited to discuss and draw up plans for the towns and cities where they live. And they're typically split into two groups. Half are told they're residents from the present day, and the other half are given these ceremonial robes to wear, those orange robes you can see there, and told to imagine themselves as residents from the year 2060. And it turns out, as residents from 2060, they systematically advocate far more transformative plans for their town or city, whether it's healthcare investment or investment in climate change resilience. And this movement is spreading across Japan. It's used in big cities like Kyoto and Japan's Ministry of Finance. I like to see it used in towns and cities across Britain and Europe. You could even imagine a Cheney having a future council where it makes decisions, or it looks at the impacts of the school or governor's decisions and how they might impact Cheney students from 2050. They could even have their own gowns. So there are the 7 ways of thinking long term, 7 very practical real life projects. What I'd like you to do now in the chat is to just quickly write down, I'll give you a minute to do this, which of these projects do you find most inspiring and why? So you could just put the number or the name and give me a little sentence or so on which one you find inspiring or powerful. I'm curious to know.